Have you ever done everything right, and then everything went completely wrong? You live kindly. You never stop praying. You faithfully give. You care for your family. You believe that if you live righteously, then blessings will follow. But then one day, God goes silent, and everything begins to fall apart. Welcome to Prayer Station. Why do the wicked succeed while the righteous suffer in silence? Why are the most sincere prayers the ones that go unanswered? You once believed in the promise, but now all you have left is the ashes of what used to be a dream. Family, career, health, reputation. Everything that was once beautiful is now just a memory. Have you ever felt like an enemy of God himself? Have you ever doubted maybe he's angry at me and I don't even know why? Have you ever asked God, what did I do wrong? And received nothing but a deep, echoing silence? Maybe you're in the middle of an unnamed trial, a season where God does not explain but watches every reaction. And you're not the first. There was once a man whom God himself called righteous, upright, unmatched, yet he was also thrown into the fire without explanation. He lost everything, one thing after another. His name was Job. And if you're in a battle your soul can't even understand, then this is the story you need to hear. Because Job isn't just a man from the past. A Job is the mirror of all of us. Those who once loved God with all our hearts, yet found ourselves tested to the very edge, with no warning at all. The story of Job is the hardest question every believer must face, and it may just be the answer you need right now. The greatest test in following God is not poverty, not the loss of a loved one, not even when your body is wrecked by disease. It is when God does not answer. When you have prayed, you've fasted, you've lived holy, you've forgiven, you've believed, you've remained faithful, but God still stays silent. That silence is not absence. It is a different kind of presence, a kind of testing with no sirens, a storm with no explanation, a trial without pre-given answers. Job is the model of true believers, not a sinner being punished, not a fool being awakened, but a man God himself praised in heaven. There was no one like him. So why would a man praised by God be thrown into heaven's darkest silence? Why would the most righteous face the most painful challenge? Why would God choose not to respond? Because there are trials, not to correct, not to punish, but to expose what remains when everything else is stripped away from faith. When promises break, when prayers go unanswered, when the heart feels empty and heaven shuts its gates, will you still choose to believe? That is the real test. And that's why the story of Job isn't just about suffering. It's about a faith that doesn't need to understand everything to remain faithful to the end. And that's why the story of Job doesn't begin with failure. It begins with a commendation from the very mouth of God. In heaven, where angels gathered and even the accuser appeared, God spoke a name. Not a king, not a priest, not a prophet, but a righteous man living on the earth, Job. Have you considered my servant Job? That question echoed in the courts of heaven. And that very question unleashed the most terrifying supernatural trial ever permitted upon a man. So who was Job? Why did God mention him as a living proof of reverence? Why did both heaven and hell turn their gaze upon him? Let us return to the beginning, to the place where Job had not yet lost anything. But God had already seen everything. before the blood was shed, before heaven's silence weighed heavily on the human soul. A man was living in the light, in blessing, in complete righteousness. A man heaven once praised, a man hell dared not ignore. His name was Job. In the fertile land of Uz, where fields stretched to the horizon and camels strode like royal battalions, there was a man the people called righteous. Not because of wealth, though he owned thousands of sheep, oxen, camels, and servants. Not because of fame, though his name was spoken in the councils of elders and echoed across generations, but because he lived as if standing before the face of God every single day. Job was not just a man of the law, he rose above the law. Every day he lived with a holy fear that he might grieve the heart of God. And every morning before the sun had risen, he stood before the altar, smoke rising, hands lifting the offering. Not for himself, but for those he loved. Because he thought, what if my children have sinned in their hearts or cursed God in their thoughts? No proof, no event, just a holy fear that even the smallest thing hidden in the human heart, it might be enough to make the eyes of God turn away. This was a faith that sought no reward, a love that demanded nothing in return, a virtue that never waited for applause. And then, in the realm of eternity where angels gather among the heavenly hosts, among the unseen realms, God himself spoke, not to rebuke, but to commend a man on the earth. He said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears me and shuns evil." Pause and consider. Job did not hear those words. He did not know his name was being spoken among millions of angels. There is no indication that he received any reward from that heavenly statement. But the greatest honor is not being acknowledged by men. It is being named by the Creator himself before all of heaven. Because of a life lived in truth. Because of a faith unmixed. Because of a love that had no conditions. And in that very moment the metaphysical war began. A righteous man, a man trusted by God, a man Satan sought to destroy to prove a point. No one truly loves God unless they are being blessed. But that is what Satan doesn't understand. True faith is not based on what the eyes can see. It is not moved by circumstances. It doesn't collapse when heaven goes silent. Heaven stayed silent. No warnings, no prophetic dreams. Just another ordinary morning, but it would become the darkest day in the life of a righteous man. Job had no idea that behind the invisible veil, his name had just been spoken in a dialogue between heaven and hell. He didn't know that his unconditional faith had made him the center of a divine test the world had never seen before. And when the gates of the heavenly realm closed, when Satan was permitted to act, the storm began, not gradually but all at once, like a hurricane crashing down. No warning, no time to prepare. In a single day, the man once praised by heaven itself lost everything. Each child, 10 in all, lay beneath the rubble of a collapsed house. Wealth, every flock of sheep, every camel, every faithful servant, stolen, burned, slaughtered. All that remained was one solitary man, standing among the ashes, amid a grief too deep to name. And yet, instead of cursing, instead of blaming, he looked up, and in the face of unimaginable loss, he uttered words no one could have foreseen. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And this was the beginning of the darkest part of the story, a faith about to be tested by fire, a faithful soul facing the storm that no one else could bear in his place. Everything collapsed, not in parts, but all, at once. From a distance, galloping hooves approached. The first blow came. "Master, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys grazing when the Sabians attacked. They slaughtered the servants and stole the herds. I alone escaped to tell you," before he could catch his breath. The second came like lightning. Fire fell from heaven. It consumed the sheep, it burned the servants. I, again, am the only one left alive. And again, 3 bands of Chaldeans raided. They took the camels, killed the workers. Only I escaped. Then came the final blow. Not fire, not thunder, wind. Your children were feasting in the oldest brother's house. A great wind came from the desert. The house collapsed. All are gone, and I am the only one left. No one could imagine such pain. A father, standing in the void where 10 pieces of his soul were shattered. A man, watching everything he built reduced to dust. And that was just one day. Most would have screamed, cursed, destroyed everything, fled from God. But what did Job do? He tore his robe, the symbol of a shattered soul. He shaved his head, a sign of stripped dignity. He fell to the ground, not to mourn, but to worship. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." The world was lost, but his faith remained intact. Job didn't just kneel, he knelt in worship. Not in days of wealth, but in the ruins of all that once gave him joy. In all this, Job did not sin, nor did he charge God with wrongdoing. We must pause and ask ourselves, how many of us can worship God not because he gives, but even when he takes away? How many will praise his name when the table is empty and the house echoes with silence? Job didn't love God because he was blessed. He loved God because God was God, with or without blessing. And my dear friend, the story doesn't end there, because after losing everything, Satan returned, and this time, he wanted to strike Job's very flesh. A trial even more terrifying awaits in the next chapter. People can survive emotional devastation. They may cry, collapse, then slowly rise again. But Job didn't just lose. He worshipped among the ashes. He praised God while blood still stained his hands. He glorified the name of the Lord in the moment when others would have chosen death. A response hell itself did not see coming. But Satan wouldn't stop there. Job still had one thing left, his body. And now, the enemy wants to touch Job's body, because if his faith still stood after losing everything, then let's see if it can still endure when his flesh is torn to pieces. And tragically, while Job's body was being tormented by sores, his wife, the only loved one left, became the first voice, not of comfort, but of rebellion. Job didn't just lose everything. Even his body began to betray him. From the soles of his feet to the crown of his head, painful sores erupted like fire, consuming every inch of flesh. Each step was agony. Each breath cracked his skin a little more. And then, he could no longer stand. He sat down, not on a bed, not on a chair, but in ashes, the very place where trash was thrown, where waste was cast aside. Job sat there like a discarded fragment of life itself. What he has in his hand is not a bruised stick or towel, but a fragment. A piece of oozing blood was used to catch the swelling and bleeding of the wound and torture him day and night. No one to care for, no comfort left, children to embrace. And in that moment, the only one left by his side, his wife of many years, didn't whisper hope. She didn't wipe away his tears. She looked at her broken husband and released a sentence like a final blade piercing a soul already bleeding. Curse God and die. Not an enemy, not a stranger, but his wife, one who once offered sacrifices with him, prayed for their children and smiled when harvest came. Now she is the one telling him to end it. If you were Job, how would you respond? A man sitting in the ashes, torn apart by life, his body decaying, and the last person close to him has turned her back. But Job did not curse God. In the ashes, with a faint breath and a voice soaked in tears, he simply said, "Shall we accept good from God and not accept trouble?" That sentence transcends time. It pierces the deepest places of souls drowning in despair. Job didn't understand why he was suffering this much, but he refused to betray God. He still chose to trust, even as his body was slowly dying minute by minute. And that was the moment the spiritual battle shifted to a deeper level. But sometimes, the most painful thing is not the loss. It's when those who come to comfort you end up making the wound bleed even more. Job endured physical pain. He faced the cold silence of his wife. He still held on to faith, even as his body decayed, even as he sat in ashes like a broken man left behind by life. Then 3 friends came, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They came not with swords or accusations. They came with tear-filled eyes and garments torn to shreds. When they saw Job from a distance, they didn't recognize him. They sat down and said nothing. 7 days, 7 nights. But that silence didn't last forever. Because after the silence comes speech. And not words of comfort, but words that pierce the soul. They didn't just misunderstand Job, they judged him. They assumed if he's in this much pain, right, surely he must have sinned. They assumed if he's been struck down, it must be righteous punishment from heaven. Job, the one who had once been praised by all of heaven, is now doubted by his friends, and his heart begins to stir. Why do the wicked prosper, and the righteous like me are crushed? We're stepping into the next part. This is the moment when Job is no longer just battling physical pain, but also facing a distorted view of God from the very faith community around him. People often say, in hardship you discover your true friends. But sometimes they don't come to save you. They come to make the wound bleed more. After Job lost everything, his children, his wealth, his honor, and even his health, he didn't break under the circumstances. He broke because the ones who should have understood him the most understood nothing at all. 3 friends came, and they were silent. No judgment, no hollow words of comfort. They sat by the ashes, staring at Job, just a shadow of who he once was. 7 days, 7 nights. Not a word. They wept. They threw ash upon their heads. They let pain speak in their place. And in that moment it seemed as if they were hurting with Job. But then they opened their mouths, and every word, every sentence felt like a spear into the bleeding soul of their beloved friend. Eliphaz, the wisest of the 3, spoke. Who was ever innocent that perished? Or where were the upright destroyed? The implication? If Job was suffering, it must be because he sinned. What sin? They didn't know. But surely, God wouldn't do this without a reason. Bildad spoke even colder words. Your children died, perhaps because of their sin. No one mentioned the tears Job once shed as he offered sacrifices each morning for every one of his children. No one mentioned the intercession of a trembling father, fearing his children might have offended God. Now all of that swept away by one cruel sentence. Zophar, the youngest, didn't hesitate to declare, God has been too lenient with you. They didn't come on to journey with him. They came to analyze, to reason, to preach. But they didn't understand. God is not a math problem, and suffering is not always punishment. Job, sitting in ashes with broken pottery, scraping his sores, had to do the hardest thing in his life: stand you and defend yourself. He, the former pillar of the land of Uz, now had to prove that he was not wicked, not secretly sinful, not a hypocrite. And when he turned to heaven, it wasn't to accuse, it was to ask, Lord, why? Why do the wicked live long, have many children, dwell in peace, while the righteous are crushed in silence? Why are you silent? Why do the prayers of those who fear you bounce back from emptiness? This wasn't just the cry of Job. It was the cry of millions of believers across the world. Those who prayed until their throats were dry, fasted until they were worn thin, believed until they had nothing left. But the miracle never came. And the greatest pain wasn't the loss. It was when the loss was called justice. Why? Why do some come not to wipe your tears, but to draw a dagger? Why do they speak in God's name, words he never said? Why do friends, instead of standing in Job's battle line up with the enemy to accuse? Job said, I know, my Redeemer lives, but I want to see him. I want to speak. I want to understand why. And my brother. Inside each of us, there is a part of Job crying out, I don't need answers. I just need to see you. And that's when God himself stepped out of the silence to begin an entirely different chapter of the story. Not swords, not sickness, not the death of children. The real battle was heaven's silence. It's when you look up to heaven and heaven doesn't respond. When you pray with everything inside you and only hear your heartbeat echo in the void. When the tears have dried and every word of comfort becomes meaningless. That's when Job faced the greatest pain a believer could ever endure. Being met by God with silence. Friends accused him. His body was ruined. His possessions were reduced to ashes. And now even the presence of God seemed to withdraw. Job wept, not because of pain, but because he didn't understand. Why, oh God, or would you be silent to someone who has loved you his whole life? Where were you when I was tormented, shamed, abandoned, and despised? This was no ordinary trial. This was where the soul was crushed, not by people, but by the silence of heaven. And then, in that deepest night, Job did not choose bitterness. He did not renounce his faith. Instead, he declared a prophecy so profound that even the heavens fell silent. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. That wasn't religious talk, not a church slogan, but the cry of a faithful soul. In the depths of utter despair, Job didn't need a miracle. He didn't need healing, didn't need an explanation. He only needed one thing, that no matter what, he would still choose to believe. And it's in that place where a person is stripped of every blessing, where faith is no longer a feeling, no longer a reward, but a raw, aching choice amid exhaustion. That is where true faith is found. Faith, not because of what God does, but because of who he is. That was the real battle, where the righteous do not fight the world, but the silence of heaven itself. And then, when a person reaches the very end of faith, heaven begins to move. But then, in the thickest darkness, in the suffocating silence of heaven, something happens. Not a miracle, not thunder, not an angel descending from the heights, but a whirlwind. A storm came, not to destroy Job, but to pull back the curtain on something he and all humanity had never seen. a God who doesn't need to justify himself, only to show up. When every human voice has gone silent, when the mind can no longer explain anything, when the heart is empty, then the Creator steps into the storm and begins to speak. Where were you? When did I lay the foundations of the earth? That question wasn't just for Job. It was for every one of us, because right at the edge of faith, a supernatural encounter is about to begin. When man falls silent and heaven begins to speak, imagine. A man once praised by all of heaven, now trembling in the ashes, his body covered in sores, his heart torn apart, and his faith on the verge of collapse. He had lost everything: his wealth, his children, his honor, and in the end, even the answer. For chapter after chapter, Job cried out in despair. He asked the same questions that millions of souls have asked. Why? Where is God? What did I do wrong? Not a single answer. Heaven remained silent. The emptiness is unbroken, but then, in the parched space of reason, amid sobs still echoing in the frozen wilderness of faith, Job hears a sound, not a gentle whisper, not a soft light, but the roaring of a storm, a voice that shatters the sky. From within the whirlwind, God appears, and the first thing he does, it is not healed, it is not explained, it is not comfortable, but ask a question, not just one, not 10, but dozens, hundred of questions, like blades piercing through every layer of human pride. Were you there when I laid the earth's foundation? Do you understand the path of light? Can you bind the chains of Orion? Can you command the dawn to rise and drive away the darkness? Not a single answer could be given, because this was no longer a conversation. It was a manifestation. Each word, each sentence, like thunder crashing into a shattered soul. Each line, shaking the very cosmos within Job. He, the man who once demanded that God appear in court, now trembled in silence. No more reasoning, no more accusations, no more demands for justice. Only one thing remained: the presence, too vast, too holy, too transcendent, of the Creator. And then, in the dust and the tears, Job uttered just one line. A line that every soul touched by the glory of God would understand. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Before, he believed in God because of his teachings, because of doctrine, because of logic, because of experience. But now, he had truly encountered him. Not through blessings, not through miracles, but through the storm. It was in the pain, it was during the break, it was in the injustice he could never comprehend. That Job saw God, and that was enough. He no longer needed to know why he had suffered, no longer needed to uncover the hidden plan. Because the most precious thing wasn't the answer, but the encounter with the one who made him. And there, amid the whirlwind and the ashes, Job was reborn, not by wealth, not by miracles, but by revelation. Because sometimes God doesn't need to explain anything. His presence is the answer. When Job placed his hand over his mouth, silenced before the Creator, when he no longer demanded justice but bowed in worship, something unexpected happened. The Lord, who had just wrapped himself in the whirlwind, began to act, not with iron swords or furious wrath, but with gracious restoration. No warning, no conditions, no deals. Only pure love and grace that surpasses all understanding. When the human soul has been crushed, when pride has been dismantled, that is the moment God begins to rebuild. And now, you're about to enter the stage no one expected, not an ending, but a glorious beginning. After all, the Lord did not stay silent forever. Right when all hope seemed lost, when there was nothing left to cling to, when even your faith felt doubtful. He stepped in, not with gentle comfort, not with logical explanations, but with a whirlwind echoing from the throne of heaven. He didn't answer your questions with a reason. He didn't explain your suffering. Instead, he unveiled his majesty. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Did you bind the lightning, send the rain, feed the wild beasts their prey? Do you know the paths of Jupiter and Venus? Have you walked through the gates of death? These were questions that needed no answers. Questions with the power to shatter every ounce of human pride. And at that moment, you have nothing left to say. You realize there are things you don't need to know, only to trust. You place your hand over your mouth and whisper in the ashes, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." But it is precisely in that lowest place, in that moment you accept that you don't understand, that God begins to act. He didn't just restore your possession, but gave them back double. Didn't just give you back a family, but gave you greater honor and blessing than before. Didn't just forgive you, but used you to intercede for the very ones who once accused you. You went through the fire, but were not burned. You descended to the depths, but were not abandoned. And when you came out, you weren't just healed. You became a witness of grace. Maybe the most important part wasn't that Job was restored, not the doubled wealth, not the children born afterward, but his heart was transformed. From someone who knew about God through teachings to someone who had touched his presence directly. Faith was no longer based on rumor, but on revelation. No longer doctrine, but relationship. No longer asking, "Why did God let this happen?" but declaring, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." And it was that unconditional surrender, that trust without the need for reasons, that became Job's true victory over Satan. But if this was the journey of a man praised by heaven itself, then the question must be asked, what are we meant to understand from this story? Did Job remain silent forever? Or is there something he's still saying to our generation today? And what allows a person to endure such suffering without losing their faith? This is the moment. We need a deeper perspective. Let us hear from a shepherd's heart to uncover layers of meaning that perhaps you've never heard before. Dear friend, the story of Job does not end with restoration. It ends with the silence of God and the surrender of a man. And this is where many Christians stumble. You've asked before, have I done anything wrong? I still pray, still worship. So why would God let this happen? You searched for answers, but all you found was heaven's cold silence. And that silence turned into doubt, then bitterness, then distance. But let me, speaking as a shepherd, tell you this. God doesn't explain because real faith doesn't need explanations. Real faith needs an encounter. It was precisely when Job received no reasons that he received a revelation. It's when you don't understand the why that you become ready to understand who he is. Because God never builds faith on logic, he builds it on intimacy. Today, many are just like Job, not living in sin, not doing wrong, yet enduring what feels like punishment. And we conclude, I must have done something wrong. But no, I tell you today with all my pastoral heart, it's not punishment, it's selection. Job was not being punished. He was chosen to testify to true faith before heaven and hell. And there are trials in your life not to prove you were wrong, but to prove your faith is real. Dear friend, if today you're living like Job, not understanding why everything is falling apart, seeing no way out, hearing no voice from God, don't retreat, don't doubt, because maybe you're being chosen by heaven to be a witness, not to be explained to, but to be revealed to. And when that moment comes, you will understand. Everything that once fell apart was part of a perfect plan. If you're still asking, but why isn't God speaking? Doesn't He see that I'm falling apart? Then remember, God never explained Himself to Job, but He showed up. And after that moment, Job needed no more words. Because when you truly see who God is, all that you once lost, all the questions you once screamed, will be replaced by a silence not of despair, but of having seen enough. And then, God will not only come, He will restore. Not just double your possessions, not just return your children, but restore your faith itself, refined through fire. Now is the time for your response, not with complaints, but with a choice. Will you let the trial define you, or let God reveal Himself in the midst of it? Get ready, because the moment you stop demanding an answer, God will give you a revelation. And when that happens, you will never be the same. You see, Satan struck at the most precious things: family, wife, beau, reputation, faith. But he forgot one thing. You can take everything from a man of God, but you can't take God from that man. Job sat in ashes, but heaven recorded every tear that fell to the ground. And then, before the morning even broke, a roar thundered from eternity. Job did not abandon me, and I will not abandon Job. Have you ever thought God was silent? He's not. He's writing an ending that will silence all of hell. You've watched Job's story, and if you saw yourself in it, then you're not just a viewer. You are someone God is choosing amid the fire. And if the trial you're facing is too great to explain, take heart. Because it wasn't made to be explained, but to bring Him glory. Prayer Station will return with stories long buried, truths the enemy never wanted you to discover, people the world forgot. But heaven still remembers every whispered cry. Subscribe now, turn on the notification bell, and prepare your heart, because what's coming next will ignite your faith. This isn't just a video, this is a call from heaven.